Waba, welcome to this week's edition of Africa in Focus. Myself, Kwame, Ghanaian broadcaster, writer, journalist, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Africa in Focus is part two. We're still talking South Africa, but this time it's about the land issue, the great betrayal by Mandela and the ANC, the land issue in South Africa. All right, so that's this week's edition of Africa in Focus, looking at the land issue in South Africa, because it's a very, very important issue that we need to talk about. All right, so before we get into today's program, just to make you aware that if you love the show, if you like the show, please share to your friends, family, and social media networks. And please subscribe to the Ghana Africa in Focus podcast on YouTube and also on Spotify. We want to try and get, 800 followers on Spotify this year. And we're going to try and get, at least 400 on YouTube. So please subscribe to the Ghana Africa in Focus podcast on YouTube and also on Spotify as well. We are no longer on Google, but you may be able to go to Google, but we are now on YouTube. So if you are on Google, please subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube. All right, so we are no more being sponsored by GrowthMe Ghana. The sponsorship came to an end a couple of weeks ago, so we are looking out for new sponsors. So that is where we are with that. So we are no longer being sponsored by GrowthMe Ghana, but I will still advise you advise you to, be a sponsor of a Ghanaian farmer. Very, very, very worthwhile project that we're doing. So please, be a sponsor of a Ghanaian farmer by going on the Grow For Me Ghana website. You can Google Grow For Me Ghana and you can get all the details that you need to support a Ghanaian farmer. All right, so, and if you also are wanting to do business in Ghana, buy land, buy property, etc., we do offer a consultancy service whereby we can tailor make a package that suits your needs. So we charge $30 an hour session, and we charge $20 for a half an hour briefing. All right. So if you want to book your consultation with myself, I'll leave you my email address in the footnotes to the show, and you can just email me to book in your consultation. All right, so let's get into the podcast. Part two, South Africa, the great betrayal of Mandela and the ANC, the land issue in South Africa. Now, before I get into the issue per se, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't put on, the sources last week because of the lot of info I wanted to put on. So I'll put on that video of John Pilger, why apartheid never ended, and you will understand that South Africa today is still an apartheid state. Also, I'll put you the video of the whites-only town in South Africa called Orange, white-only town, to show you the ridiculous of today's South Africa, where you can have the white people have their own town, where no African people are allowed to come into that town. And then I'll also tell you about the Land Act. So I didn't Google that last week, but today is obviously an essential part of our discussion, looking at the land issue in South Africa. So, how many of you are aware that in 1913, so-called Native Act, that was a law that was implemented, by the British in particular, and then the Dutch, but primarily the British, they implemented this wicked so-called Native Land Act of 1913. And again, I'll put this in the notes to the show, so you can see it for yourself and do more research on it. So the Native Land Act of 1913, issued by the British, right, was a law that implemented racial segregation in land ownership in South Africa. So under this so-called Native Land Act, it restricted land ownership to specific areas for each racial group. So the majority of their fertile land was reserved for white people or Caucasian people. The law, now check this, this is how wicked the law was towards us Africans, So this law also prohibited any purchase or lease of land by African people outside the townships and reserves that have been designated for African people. So under this act, African people could not buy or lease land in their own country. Isn't that ridiculous? Now, it also stated that, you know, it also restricted the terms of tenure in which Africans could live on so-called white-owned farms. Yeah, and this wicked, brutal act of 1913, this led to the forced removal, the forced removal of African people and the creation of racially segregated areas known as Bantusans. Okay, so this Land Act of 1913, so-called Native Land Act, right? That is the genesis of how Africans lost their land and how Europeans stole the land through this legal bogus framework, to take up the chunk of their land to the extent that today, and this is according to, a 2017 audit by the South African government, that stated that 72% of the country's arable lands is in the hands of Caucasians who occupy or who account for less than 10% of the population of South Africa. And South Africa's population is more than 65 million people. And South Africa is about 2.5 times to 3 times the size of the UK. Yeah. So that puts it in perspective for you. Yeah. South Africa is about the size of a couple of big states in the US. South Africa is about half the size of Canada. Yeah. Shows you how big South Africa is. Yeah. And so 70% of the best land is still in white hands. This is 30 years after so-called democracy, 30 years after the so-called end of apartheid. But like I said, apartheid is still real. Yeah. And this land issue is proof of that, because think about it now. So African people make up more than 70% of the population in South Africa, but yet they don't have more than 10% of their land. 10%, less than 10% of the land in South Africa is owned by African people. Do you know what is done to African people? This makes African people, in effect, landless and stateless in their land, in their own country. So when you don't control your land, you in essence don't control the production of food. You don't control or have any say in the wealth of the land in terms of the gold, the oil, the diamonds, the bauxite, the timber that's in the land in South Africa. You don't have any say in that because you don't own the land in your own country. And these so-called townships and, so-called settlements that the wicked, brutal British and Dutch Caucasians reserved for us, African people, is where African people live. So somewhere like Soweto, which is a so-called township outside Johannesburg, is a little parcel of land, but yet it is overpopulated by African people, because that's what, under this wicked Native Land Act, was reserved for us. And so, how then did Nelson Mandela and the ANC not even address this issue that leaves today over 70% of the most fertile arable land in South Africa is owned by a minority of Caucasian people? So this is the great betrayal, as I put it, that Mandela and the ANC made when they entered into so-called negotiations with F.W. de Klerk and the other Boer stroke European politicians, when he was released from prison in 1990. Okay, because the land issue, as I mentioned last week in part one, the land issue was at the core of the tenets as issued in the Freedom Charter. That said that the ANC in any negotiation, or sorry, in any future negotiations would discuss the land issue to give the original owners their land back or have autonomy as a certain part of their land. So why did Nelson Mandela and the ANC renege on this key aspect of the Freedom Charter, i.e. giving back land to its rightful owners? Because this land that was stolen by Europeans, Caucasians, under this wicked native land act of 1913, yeah, is proof that the Europeans did not own in the land. The land that they got was stolen through brute force and through trickery of law. So that's why today, you have these so-called white farmers in South Africa, particularly in areas like Western Cape, the Orange State, parts of KwaZulu-Natal, owning vast tracts of land that is for agriculture. Yeah. But yet, despite, these Caucasian European farmers having vast amounts of land, African people are still hungry. You know that? African people are still hungry in their own country, but yet you have Caucasian farmers supposedly, growing food. But where does that food go? It doesn't go to South Africans, particularly Africans in South Africa. A lot of the food that is going to South Africa is for export. A big example is apples. South Africa is one of the world's biggest producers of apple, the famous Cape apple. Yeah. And the farmers who grow that Cape apple are European, not Africans, but they are European. Yeah. And South African apples are amongst the most popular in the world. Yeah. And that brings in a lot of revenue for South Africa. But yet that land is quote unquote controlled and owned by Caucasian people. So this is a reason why, like I say again, I said before, that Nelson Mandela and the ANC betrayed African people in South Africa because they should have negotiated for the land. That will make our people not landless and not stateless in their own country. And so today, when you have a situation where now 70% of the population, sits on just 5% or 5 to 10% of the land, it is quite obvious that people will struggle, that people will not have a share in the country's wealth, that people will not have a share in the country, period. Because if you don't own land, the land is the key. It's key to any nation. Land is a central part of nation building and development. Yeah? So if you, as African, do not own any land in your own country, that basically makes you, you're nothing. You're nobody. And so for Nelson Mandela and the ANC to not even negotiate this key aspect, is tantamount to treason and tantamount to betrayal of the highest order for African people. And so while South Africa today is celebrating so-called 30 years of democracy, there's nothing to celebrate. There is nothing to celebrate in South Africa today. Democracy is a sham, it's a fraud, and more importantly, African people in South Africa do not own their land, do not have their own land in their own country. And so this land issue for me is very, very critical. And this is why white wealth is still dominating in the country. So this is why I say apartheid never died. Because if white people Caucasian people can control A, the land, B, the resources on that land, and C, the wealth that comes out of the resources of the land, that just shows that apartheid never died. Apartheid did not die in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. In actual fact, there is a new form of apartheid called economic apartheid, and even land apartheid, yeah, whereby African people don't really have a stake or ownership in their own country. That is a massive betrayal that Nelson Mandela and the ANC, because after Mandela left in 99, Thabo Mbeki, he was president of South Africa between 2008 and 2019. I beg your pardon, sorry, 2015, because they have 2 terms in South Africa. So Thabo Mbeki had 2 terms, 15. That's when Zuma came. Yeah. And Zuma only had 1 term because of the corruption. Right. So Mbeki did not discuss the land issue. Zuma did not discuss the land issue. And now Ramaphosa, he wants to be re-elected. By the way, there's elections in South Africa later on in May. He wants to be re-elected for a 2nd term. But he has not addressed the land issue. So it tells about the ANC through this so-called negotiation program that led to so-called multi-party democracy in 1994. The ANC reneged on that promise that they made to the African people to renegotiate for the land. They really didn't care about the land. And so today, African people in South Africa are landless and homeless. And because they don't understand, those South African, particularly those Black South Africans who are born after 1994, do not know, their parents haven't taught them anything about the struggle. Their parents haven't taught them anything about what the struggle entailed. Their parents haven't told them about, the essence of the Freedom Charter. They believe in their naivety, in their foolishness, that it's the African people that are stealing their land and their jobs and their economy. This is why you Black South Africans are beating on your African sister and brother from Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Botswana, Mozambique, what have you. But yet, you dare not take the land back like what Zimbabwe did, and I'll come to that in a minute. But you're not challenging those Europeans, Caucasians, who stole your land of your ancestors. You're not challenging them. Why? Why are you scared of them? Are you scared of them, Black South Africa? I'm talking to you now. Are you scared of Europeans in your own country not taking back your land? So you, in your ignorance, your arrogance, you have not chastised the ANC, but rather you are beaten on your African sister and brother in South Africa. Was it they that stole your land? You so-called Black South Africa, I'm talking to you. Was it African people that stole your land? Did African people lay down the Native Act 1913? Was it they that constructed that program? Was it Africans that implemented that Native Land Act 1913? So the real enemy is a Caucasian, not the African, because the African didn't steal land, and the African didn't, initiate and implement a so-called Native Land Act of 1913. You need to study, you Black South Africans particularly, need to study that Native Land Act of 1913, because that's why you're in the position today that you're in. Because that was at the core of racial segregation, and that was a key element of apartheid, taking the land of the indigenous African people. So now let me come to this issue about, the land per se. And why South Africa should do what Mugabe did in Zimbabwe. Because, you know, they're not going to give up the land. It's as simple as that. European, Caucasian people in South Africa are not going to give up the land like that. According to Nelson Mandela, before, you know, he relinquished the presidency in 1999, there was meant to be a so-called willing buyer, willing seller agreement in order to give back African people their land. And this is what he highlighted in that John Pilger documentary that I'll put forward in the footnotes. But, oh, really? Is there really a willing buyer, willing seller? Are white people, Caucasian people, who are the descendants of those unscrupulous people who, A, fought in the Anglo-Boer War to take Africans off their land, and B, cemented that war by creating an act that will prohibit African people from owning land, from leasing land, and also, you know, creating land or reserve land, bushland, that only Africans could live in. So the white people are not going to give it up because they reap the benefits of what the land provides. They reap the wealth of what the land provides. And so the only solution is basically to take it back with force. Because how do you think they got land in the first place? How do you think Caucasians, Europeans in South Africa got the land that they have on today? It wasn't through negotiation. It wasn't through, you know, let's sit down together and let's see how we can, you know, share the country. No, they used brute force, take the land off you, Africans, and B, they made up laws like this bogus so-called Native Land Act 1913, right, to justify their land theft. Because that's what it is, land theft. And so the only way the African people in South Africa are going to get their land back is basically you need to wage war, brute force. Because if you believe, and there's a white woman, I think I forgot her name, but she's a member of the EFF, right? She said, and I think I can get that interview on YouTube that she did, if you think that white people are going to give up their land back easily, then you're naive and gullible. And I'm saying this to our African people in South Africa, right? If you believe, you think for 1 minute that these Europeans, Caucasian people in South Africa are going to give you back the land that they stole, you're going to be waiting another 1,000 years. You have no option but to fight fire with fire. Do what Zimbabwe did. Right? You basically have to take back the land that was stolen from you. You got no option. Because as we've seen with so-called negotiation that led to the so-called Rainbow Nation of 1994, South Africa, Black South Africa in particular, has been a lose-lose situation. Because in that negotiation of in the early 90s, F.W. de Klerk said that I am not going to negotiate myself out of power. I want to say that again. F.W. de Klerk, prior to the negotiations in the 90s, that created the so-called democracy that you have today in South Africa. He said, I am not going to negotiate myself out of power. What did that mean? What it meant was three things. That one, white people, Caucasian people are going to keep the land. Two, the wealth on that land is going to be in white hands, i.e. the gold, the diamond, the timber, the manganese, etc. It's going to be in white hands. And three, the wealth out of that land will still be our wealth. That's what the Klerk meant by that. And so for Nelson Mandela and the ANC to allow Europeans to basically keep South Africa as like a white enclave is a betrayal of African people in South Africa. And so in closing, land is very, very central to any people. They live or die on the land. The taking over of African land by European terrorists, yeah, was the act of war. That Native Land Title Act 1913 was the act of war on African people. B, that wealth that South Africa, or rather should I say that white South Africa enjoys today, that wealth that they enjoy was predicated on taking the land from African people. Because the resources on the land do not belong to African people, it belongs to them. And so there needs to be a realignment. South Africa will never be free. African people will never be free in South Africa unless they reclaim their land back. And the only way you're going to do that is by brute force. And by the way, this land issue is not just an issue in South Africa. All over Southeast Africa, it's a very, very important issue. In Kenya, Britain today, this bastard of a country called Britain, still owns large tracts of land in Kenya. Did you know that? You didn't know that, did you? Zimbabwe, despite what Mugabe did in the early 2000s, we hear that the current president of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, has given some of the land back to so-called white farmers. In Namibia is even worse. Namibia, tiny country, well, it's a big country, land mass, but a population of 2.6 million people. But yet, 70 to 80% of the best land in Namibia is owned by white people, Caucasian people. In Botswana, a similar thing as well. The best land in Botswana is owned by European Caucasian people. So this tells you why this issue of land is important, particularly in southern East Africa. Yeah, because African people, because of these land acts that were done by the wicked British, these land acts that sought to steal African land from indigenous original people, has made African people, particularly in South Africa, homeless. So in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Namibia, in Botswana, in parts of Kenya, African people are landless and stateless. And the only solution is not to negotiate. How can you negotiate with somebody who A, took land by force, and B has no intention of giving that land back peacefully, and C, has no vested interest in giving back that land because they live off the wealth of that land. So you cannot negotiate with somebody like that. You're going to have to take it by brute force. By force. The same way that their ancestors, the European Caucasians of today, their ancestors, the same way that their ancestors stole the land using brute force, in the same way today, African people, particularly South Africa, if you want to be free, right, if your freedom day means anything to you, you got to take your land back by any means necessary, as Malcolm X would say. And so, until then, you are a landless people, you are a stateless people, and you are definitely not free. And apartheid still reigns supreme in South Africa. And so I hope you've enjoyed part 2. Final part 2, looking at South Africa, the Great Betrayal by Nelson Mandela and the ANC, the land issue. Land is very, very important. And our people in Tanzania, so-called South Africa, need back their land if they're going to be free. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it to your friends, your family, social media networks. Please subscribe to the Ghana African Focus podcast on YouTube, also on Spotify. We want to get 800 followers by the end of the year. We want to get at least 300 to 400 subscribers on YouTube. So please tell your friends, tell your family, to your social media networks about Ghana African Focus podcast. This powerful, powerful podcast aims to provide you with a lot of news and information, not just from Africa, but also from Ghana as well. All right, so for myself, Kwame, and from all the crew here on Africa in Focus. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week for some more Africa in Focus.